I think it's all pretty dire at the moment, and I wonder what your views on how we actually protest in a way that might make the government take notice. Because they seem to be very against just stop oil,
Yes.
but they have
Yes,
raised it.
yes, well, I think current tactics are uh, basically wrong. I think they've been useful in drawing attention to the climate emergency, but that is now so obviously before us that these efforts should be scaled down. Green parties have also done a very good job on this. I think their problem is they've been sucked into a lot of other progressive measures, which are peripheral to the climate emergency, and they haven't hammered home their basic message. And I think movements like Stop Oil and so on are counterproductive because they obviously turn people off rather than take them alongside. My book recommends, first of all, that all the anti-climate change movement should get together and organize as a political party and with a radical program and organize themselves really as a populist party, no holds barred, model themselves on the Brexit party or the Five Star movement in Italy in its prime before it too compromised with the government in order to attract votes. And its policy should be, first of all, to get a guaranteed minimum income for everybody. That would mean not paying out to everybody, but paying out to people whose income falls below that of a decent living standard. To do that, they would have to reform the tax system. That ought to be the first plank in their platform to get popular support. Otherwise, you'll get the Uxbridge effect. People agree with climate action in general, but when it affects them, they oppose it. I think the guaranteed minimum income would get considerable popular support. Then the main environmental policy should be rewilding. I think that's the most effective and quickest way of combating emissions, along, of course, with protection of the seabed, maritime conservation zones and so on, very important. And the speeding up of the efforts that bodies like the National Trust and so on are taking to restore bogland, woodland, and so on. They would probably have to ban chemical agriculture unless they can be shown not to have any environmental effects, rather than the current practice that they're permitted if they can't be shown to have negative effects. So they should only be permitted if they have positive effects. That would be one radical policy, which would also deal with sewage and pollution of rivers and so on. I think basically we're now at the stage where a total climate emergency on a war footing has to be declared so that the governments can take drastic action as the climate change accelerates. The problem really is that climate change is now proceeding at a pace the scientists did not predict. They had in the 1990s put it at 2050. They're now revising their estimates, and the accelerated rate of change is surprising even them. I mean, they've predicted rapid change, but not this rapid. So basically, I think that we need a radical new action in politics to get governments to do what they should be doing on climate.
I'd agree completely with that. And that's the trouble, isn't it? Is that ideas to try and form a new party or whatever, these rewilding and things like that, it just doesn't seem to be going quickly enough. We
No.
have a different thought
Yes.
process. effects
Well,
immediately.
I also suggest in the book a parallel movement, which should be in order to make governments look at legal tax avoidance. That is to say, environmental groups should organize to provide advice to individuals on how to avoid paying taxes or much in the way of tax, using all the legal loopholes now currently available to multinational corporations and the very rich, who only pay tax voluntarily, if at all. But of course, individuals like ourselves can't really muster the expertise to do this. So I think the environmental campaigners should get together to set up an organization which facilitates legal tax avoidance for individuals so that they can register with it, get advice, not pay tax to the government through various devices, and possibly use contribute the savings to environmental causes. I think you have to hit governments on votes and taxes to make them pay attention. These are the two fundamentals of their action. They're very capable of controlling demos and protests and ignoring them. I mean, if you take the French case of the Gilets jaunes, the protesters, who of course were right-wing protesters who didn't want environmental action, but who did paralyze the country for a spell, but have obviously been contained, as have the anti-pension reform protesters more recently. Governments are, if they can do nothing else, can contain civil disorder. And of course, they have passed the recent legislation strengthening their powers against demos, which will probably result in a lot of principled people going to prison and certainly getting publicity, but very ineffective in the way of stimulating government action. So I think the environmental movement should switch tactics as soon as possible with these objectives. I recently met with a group of Stop the Oil activists, but I really got the impression that for them, it was their individual virtue and solidarity that counted, which in a way was a sop for effective climate action. They bonded, they felt they'd made a moral and principled stand, and that in a way was the main result of the action rather than any objective response by government. It's like CND and the protests that went on for 20 or 30 years at the end of the last century, which never produced any effects in terms of nuclear policy.
It all seems very depressing. I mean, I really can't see the current government taking any action. And if we've got another 18 months, time is really running out.
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, I suppose the only attitude is that we have to take what action we can and make it as effective as possible, while possibly being generally pessimistic about the effects, but this is our little window of opportunity to make something of a difference. And if we don't take it, climate change will roll on and the world will be on fire. I haven't mentioned, of course, other effects of climate change. The first is going to be massive immigration wars across the world. At the moment, I mean, there are local wars going on from the west coast of Africa to Afghanistan in a band across the world, Sudan being the latest example. And although they have other proximate causes, one of the bases is the drying up of the Sahel and general loss of agricultural land and conflict over who's going to get control of the remaining land. So we'll have massacres, ethnic cleansing, massive immigration accompanied by disease as insects move north. Lord Frost, linking Brexit and climate change, was quoted in the newspapers during the week as saying climate change might be quite good for Britain.
Oh,
Too many people.
The main architect of a hard Brexit.
I mean, the attitude of political parties is appalling. I think there's quite a good movement about people wanting to be shouting about the problems that Brexit is causing in so many areas, but they're not doing it, and there's no movement from people in power to do it. You know, it's very difficult. I can't see how things do need to change really quickly in order to make any progress at all. But there's nobody willing to stand up and say, you know, we should be making real changes to everything we can to stop it. But now I must admit, when you said about human actions being overtaken by environmental emissions, I can see it, because you can see what's happened in the Mediterranean this summer, and you know, when you see all those fields burning, you know, when is that carbon going to be reabsorbed? I don't know.
Well, I think the problem is it's not going to be in the current course of events. As a geologist has just remarked, this is not a problem for the planet, which will probably readjust in 1 million years or so. It's a problem for us, and we will have to live with a constantly accelerating process. When would it reach equilibrium? You know, not before there's masses of carbon dioxide in the air, and the Earth will begin to resemble Venus, the sister planet, you know, with a carbon dioxide atmosphere, where the surface is so hot that the one landing vehicle they got through the clouds melted on the ground within an hour from the heat. You know, that's the kind of prospect we face. And the problem is it gets out of our control after a certain point. The only government which is trying, there is some hope, I think, in the Biden administration in the US, which has done a great deal of what is needed, but of course faces enormous opposition and also the prospect of a Republican victory in the next presidential election. Hopefully not with the accelerating climate crisis. I suppose on both Brexit and the climate, the Scottish government, which would like to get back in the EU and also has undertaken some quite far-reaching environmental initiatives, but which are being opposed, of course. The bottle collection scheme has been torpedoed, and the maritime conservation zones extension is being opposed by local fishing communities who see their livelihood being threatened. Not just local fishing communities, but large-scale commercial fishing from Aberdeen, which uses the local communities as a front. You know, until you can compensate the population properly for changes, I think you will get popular opposition. Again, general support for climate change when asked in a poll, but opposition when it involves immediate inconvenience or cost. Mostly because they lack any adequate compensation or trust that they'll get any compensation, which is why I think the first move in any effective climate movement would be the guarantee of a decent minimum income. Of course, if large-scale commercial farmers and others who are getting a lot anyway lose out, well, they'll have to lose out. I mean, they will have more than a minimum income anyway, but and the same with fishers. And oil and so on, but still a guarantee for the poorer sections of society would lose out, perhaps desperately, and not being able to put the food on the table. Then the guarantee of the decent minimum income is very important to get their support.